Welcome to Mishna study Masachet Maasrot, Peragivan Mishnah Yod. Over here in this Mishnah, we have actually a pretty interesting Mishnah, and we're going to speak a few cases about a fig tree's location. Right? So let's say you have a fig tree that you have planted in the courtyard, but the branches of the tree are hovering over into the orchard. Now remember, if you have a fig tree in the courtyard, you're allowed to only eat one at a time, and you're patur from Maasrot. If it's in the orchard, if it's out in the field, then you're allowed to have, as many as you want, until you go ahead and bring it into the courtyard. So how do we view this fig tree? So that's going to be a discussion about Mishnah, and it's going to expand into, let's say you have a tree that's, planted in Israel, and the branches, the fruit is hanging over into outside of Israel. It's hanging into Lebanon, right? Or it's hanging into, again, in Israel to outside of Israel, or vice versa, right? So we're going to have to discuss all these cases. Is something, are these obligated in Maasrot, not obligated in Maasrot? It's going to be an interesting Mishnah. So if you have a fig tree that's standing in the Hatzer, it's standing in the courtyard, it's planted in the courtyard, the roots are in the courtyard, but it's leaning over into the orchard, it's leaning over into the garden, outside the courtyard, more into the field area. So how do we view this? He goes ahead and eats however he wants, as he normally would eat achilat arai. He could snack on it as much as he wants, 3, 4, 5, 10 figs at a time, and he's patur from Maasrot. But let's say vice versa. Omedet bagina, it's planted in the orchard and it's leaning into the hatzer, nota the hatzer. Over here, review it as if it's grew in the courtyard, and he's only allowed to eat one at a time, and it's patur b'imtzirev hayav, and if you brought them together, right, that's going to be hayav, obligated to the matzah. Now, let's say you had a tree that was planted in Eretz Israel, but the branches are leaning into an area outside of Israel. It's leaning into Syria. It's leaning into Damascus. Right? Not Damascus, that would be too far. It's leaning into Lebanon. Right? How would you view this? Right? So omedet ba'aretz v'nota lachutz la'aretz. Right? This fig tree is planted in Eretz Israel, and it's leaning, right, with its fruits hanging outside of Eretz Israel. Or omedet b'chutz la'aretz v'nota la'aretz. So it's standing in Eretz Israel, in Chutz La'aretz, and outside of Israel, right? And its fruits are leaning into Eretz Israel. Hakol holech achar ha'ikar. Everything goes according to the roots, right? Where the fruit is nourishing from. So if the roots are in Eretz Israel, it's going to be obligated to the Maasrot. If the roots are outside of Eretz Israel, the roots are in Lebanon, then it's going to be patur from to the Maasrot, right? This is different, right? This is different than the first case of the Mishnah. First case in the Mishnah, we cared where the fruits were, where the branches were, where he was picking the fruit, right? If he's picking it in the courtyard, he's only allowed to pick one at a time. If he's picking it outside in the field, in the orchard, right, then he was allowed to have as much as he wants. It goes according to where the fruits were. Over here, though, in the case of the tree that's planted in Israel with fruits hanging outside of Israel, here we go according to where the roots are, right, where the where all the nourishment, right, is really being drawn from. Now, let's say you have batei arechoma. So we know batei arechoma, these are the homes that were in the walled cities. In general, we know that if you have if you purchase property in Eretz Israel, right, after 50 years, that property returns back to the original owner. That's the Yovel, the laws of Yovel. And if though you purchased a property within the walled city, right? So you go to the old city of Yerushalayim, you purchase a property in the old city of Jerusalem. Okay, this is a different law. This, after 50 years, it does not go back to the original owner. But there's a different law that applies, and that is that they have 1 year, right? The person, someone bought. Let's say I went ahead and I bought a home in the old city. So I bought it. From Joe. So Joe now has 1 year, right? 1 full year, 365 days to go ahead and redeem back the house that I bought. He could pay me the full price, right? Paid $1 million. He needs to pay me back the $1 million, and then he has his home back. But if he does not, right, if the year passes, then that home is mine forever, and it does not return back on the Yovel cycle. Now, this just doesn't just apply to homes, right? It doesn't just apply to homes, that are connected to the wall. It applies to all property within that city. And the same thing would apply for a tree, right? Any property. Let's say someone had a tree, and now we're going to ask, right? If a person had a tree within this walled city, and it was purchased, right? And let's say this tree is planted in the old city, planted in the old city of Jerusalem, and its branches are hanging outside of the city. How do we view this tree? Is this a tree that belongs to the city, to the old city, or is it a tree that really belongs to outside the city and will return back to the owners during the Yovel? So the Mishnah says, Hakol holech achar ha'ikar. Everything goes according to the roots, right? So similar to the tree that's planted in Eretz Yisrael and hanging outside of Israel from Maasrot, so to Batei Arechoma, everything goes according to the roots, right? So in that case that I just mentioned, right, everything would go, and you would have only 1 year to redeem it, and it would not go back after 50 years after the Yovel. When it comes to the in miklat, let's say you had someone who killed by mistake, a murderer by mistake, he killed someone by mistake, we know he's allowed to go ahead and seek refuge in the in miklat, in these cities of refuge, right? Now, when he's running away to the cities of refuge, let's say he goes ahead and he reaches the tchum of the city. He reaches the area outside the city, right? The 2,000 amot outside the city, and that's already considered that he reached that. He reached the city and he's protected, and the go'el adam is no longer allowed to kill him. He's protected once he reaches that tchum. Now, let's say once he reaches that tchum, that border of the city, there's a tree over there, and there's a tree that's planted within the tchum, within the boundaries of the city, and its branches are hanging outside. Or let's say even vice versa. You had a tree that was planted outside of the border, and its branches were hanging in. Right? How do we view? If a person reaches these branches of the tree, he reaches underneath the tree, right? Is he considered protected? Is he considered within the boundaries of the city or not? Now, the Gemara over here actually corrects the language of this Mishnah in Masechet Makot, and he says, Hakol olech, instead of ahar hanof, right? The correct language is af ahar hanof, even after the branches, meaning what? It goes both ways. If he's running, right, let's say the roots were within the boundary and the branches were hanging outside, once he reaches underneath those branches, that's okay. He's protected, and vice versa. Right? Let's say it was the opposite way, right? It was the branches were within the city, and the roots weren't, and you reached all the way to the to the roots, to the trunk of the tree, right? Even so, he would also be protected. So either way, he's protected through the Miklah. Ubirushalayim, when it comes to Yerushalayim, so we know there's another law when it comes to Yerushalayim that you're only allowed to redeem. Let's say a person is bringing Maaser Sheni up to Yerushalayim, he's only allowed to redeem his Maaser Sheni fruits when he's outside of Yerushalayim. Once he reaches Yerushalayim, he's no longer allowed to redeem his Maaser Sheni fruits. So let's say he's coming to Yerushalayim and there's a tree hanging from within Yerushalayim with its branches hanging outside of Yerushalayim, and he reaches underneath that tree. Is he allowed to still go ahead and redeem his fruits? So the Mishnah says, everything goes according to the nof, according to the branches. And over here, meaning what? That once he's under the branches, it's as if he's, it's as if he's within the, area of Yerushalayim, and he's no longer allowed to go ahead and redeem his Maaser Sheni fruits. Interesting Mishnah. It's interesting the differences, right? Why in the first case of the Mishnah within the courtyard we're going to where he picks it, whereas other areas with the second part of the Mishnah where the trees planted in Eretz Yisrael with it hanging outside, we go according to the roots, right? When it comes to the In Miklat, we're going according to both, right? Either one, right? When it comes to Yerushalayim, we're only going according to the branches, right? So it's interesting how each scenario has really a different law, and it's interesting something to think about why each one would be different. Go ahead. Let me know if you have any answers.